there were clearly some differentiation about their reasoning behind this, or what they wanted to highlight.
So here in the very first page, they say that the court has settled a politically charged issue in the volatile season of a presidential election, particularly in this circumstance, writings on the court should turn the national temperature down, not up. For present purposes, our differences are far less important than our unanimity. All 9 justices agree on the outcome of this case. So we are expecting a special report as the producers in our ears freak out. They don't know how we do this for a living every day. Here is a CBS News special report.
CBS News special report. I'm Tony DeCopel in New York, and we come on the air with breaking news from the Supreme Court. The justices have just ruled on whether former President Donald Trump can be disqualified as a presidential candidate and removed from state ballots as he was in Colorado and other states. Chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford has been reading this opinion, which just posted moments ago. Jan, I heard you say over the mic it was a 9-0 decision. What did the justices decide?
Well, the court has decided unanimously that the Colorado Supreme Court was wrong, that Donald Trump cannot be disqualified as a presidential candidate. So they've ruled for Trump unanimously in this case. That means that state efforts to disqualify him will end, and that if you're going to beat Donald Trump, it's going to have to be at the ballot box. It's not going to be by states trying to kick him off the ballot in the run-up to the election. Now, this decision, while the court all came together on the outcome, they all had several of them had slightly different reasons. So you had 5 justices here, a majority, speaking with one voice, saying that the Colorado Supreme Court was wrong, that Trump must win because Congress hadn't passed a law to kind of enforce how this section of the Constitution would work. You had liberal justices offering different reasons for why they believe the Colorado Supreme Court was wrong. A lot to digest in this, but the bottom line is they all agreed that Trump's arguments would carry the day in this case. I don't think that is a surprising result. After the arguments, where I think they all signaled they were highly skeptical of state efforts to disqualify a presidential candidate. The Chief Justice, for example, saying that essentially you would let one state dictate, or a handful of states dictate the outcome of the election. So I don't think this is a surprise. The Colorado Supreme Court was kind of off on a trip of their own with this ruling. Other state courts that had decided it had went a different outcome. So here we are. The decision now unanimous in agreement that Trump's arguments will carry the day. He cannot be disqualified from state ballots.
Yeah, maybe not surprising, but bracing in its clarity. 9-0. Also, that is quick work. Let's go to CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, thank you for being with us. I know you had 3 or 4 possible lines of thought that the court might take in ruling in Donald Trump's favor here and against the states. Which one ended up being the one they took?
Route number 1, which is that states can't do this alone. I counted a majority for that you would need Congress to act first and to provide some sort of enabling legislation. But this is exactly what Jan said it is, which is the court speaking with one voice on the big thing, which is the outcome. And the outcome is we're reversing the Colorado Supreme Court. And the rationale here really is we don't want states to be able to do this. And you heard this during oral arguments. You heard the justices towards the end of those hours coalesce around the idea that we're very worried states could do it alone, create this kind of patchwork when it comes to federal elections. And here's the Supreme Court, I think, doing what we typically think they can't do on these big controversial cases, uniting and saying, no, Colorado was wrong, and here are the reasons. And as Jan laid out, the reasons do splinter a bit. Justice Barrett writing a separate concurring opinion and the liberal justices writing their own concurring opinion.
Jessica and Jan, you could take this one as well. I mean, one of the questions I think people will have here is, there's an idea in the minds of about 50% of the electorate, if not a little bit more, that Donald Trump is an insurrectionist. As Liz Cheney said, he summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flames of this attack. And so the question becomes, did the Supreme Court weigh in on the merits of that particular label, Jessica, if you could take it?
So it doesn't look like that's what this hinges on. What this hinges on is instead when Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, that post-Civil War amendment that says that we're worried about people who fought in the Confederacy from once again serving in government, what specifically that says. This was not a factual trial on the merits of whether or not there was an insurrection and whether or not the former president gave aid or comfort to those who engaged in an insurrection. And of course, I would defer to Jan on the rest of that.
Jan, do you want to weigh in on that aspect of it?
No, I mean, Jessica's absolutely right. I don't see anything in here that suggests they jumped in. They weren't going to decide that anyway. They didn't have to in this case, although that also came up at argument, Tony, with some of the justices pointing out that President Trump was never charged with the crime of insurrection. So how could a state court even make these decisions, kind of counseling against that ruling at the Colorado Supreme Court?
All right. We also have Bob Costa for us, Robert Costa, as I like to say off the top, giving his full legal name. He does not have a JD. He's the only person other than me who doesn't. But you do know politics. So how is this all going to be filtered through campaign 2024?
Tony, you're hitting a sore spot. Both my parents are attorneys, and they're disappointed in me. But we're waiting to see a response from the Trump campaign and the Trump legal team at this time. But talking to sources close to the former president, they're feeling good about this already in text messages in the last few minutes. But they also know the specter of January 6th and scrutiny of the former president's actions remains very much a part of this campaign. Yes, he will be on the Colorado ballot. Yes, this addresses other issues about ballot access across the country. But looming on the horizon is a possible January 6th trial in Washington, D.C. on the federal level, as well as a January 6th trial potentially in Georgia in Fulton County. So this takes some of the issues off the table regarding January 6th for Trump, but not everything.
You know, Bob, the reason I asked that question about the merits of the term insurrection and whether the court weighed in on that aspect of it is because it's easy to imagine Donald Trump using this ruling in many different broad ways to exonerate himself in a term he's used before. Do you expect to see him using this out on the stump?
100%, Tony. When I spoke to former President Trump just a few weeks ago in New York, he said essentially the courtroom is now the campaign trail. And you can expect him to be outside federal courthouses and in front of a courthouse in Lower Manhattan starting later in March when he has a criminal hush money payments trial that's scheduled to begin. That's going to be 6 weeks long. And you can expect him to, yes, hold rallies, but really try to dominate the national conversation as someone who's aggrieved about the legal establishment in this country. For President Biden, it's a difficult issue to address because it's the Justice Department and the court.
All right, Robert Costa, you get the final word. Robert, thank you very much. And thank you, Jan. Thank you, Jessica Levinson, for reading that opinion very quickly. Just posted after 10 a.m., 9-0, Donald Trump cannot be disqualified from a state ballot. Our coverage of this Supreme Court decision will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell. Many of you will return now to CBS Mornings. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Tony DeCopel, CBS News, New York.
All right, pulling it back here. Of course, we're continuing our coverage of the breaking news. The Supreme Court has ruled that former President Donald Trump should appear on the ballot in Colorado. The decision comes after debate over whether the frontrunner for the GOP nomination violated the insurrectionist clause included in the 14th Amendment. So Derek Muller is a professor at Notre Dame Law School, and he's joining us now. And CBS News election law contributor David Becker is also joining us to kind of break it down. Hopefully you guys got a chance to peruse the decision, but it says it all really on the first and second page.
Right.
Derek, how did the court come to this decision, and how did the court decide that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does not apply to this case?
Right. So it's important to think about a couple of things. The first is that the court didn't really get into the weeds about whether January 6th was an insurrection, whether Donald Trump engaged in it, and instead focused on a structural issue. Can states enforce this mechanism, this provision of the Constitution in their ballot access rules? And for a majority of the court, They said that states just don't have this power. It is really left to Congress to make the determination about how it wants to implement and enforce this provision of the Constitution. So there was unanimity on that point. There were 9 votes for that point, but there was a little bit of dispute. And 4 of the justices disagreed with whether or not Congress has to do this by legislation, whether it's by specific mechanisms, whatever it might be. And maybe we can get into the weeds of that, but there was unanimity. All 9 justices agreed. States just have no power to enforce this on their own. It's something that needs to be left to another actor in another stage of the political process.
So, David, one of the, when I'm looking through here, it says that the court should put a swift and decisive end to these ballot disqualification efforts, which threaten to disenfranchise tens of millions of Americans and which promise to unleash chaos and bedlam if other state courts and state officials follow Colorado's lead. And yet, as we've been discussing, the Supreme Court did not weigh in on whether or not January 6th was an insurrection. So the question that I have is the one that Tony DeCopel asked during the special report, which is, will President Trump, and I know that we can't prevent him from doing this, but will he use this as the basis for saying that he's exonerated of everything that he's been accused of?
Yeah, I think obviously we can't do anything about what President Trump may do in his campaign, but you're quite right. This does not get former President Trump to the finish line. It just gets him to the starting line. This just says that he can compete in the political arena to win the presidency again, because states cannot keep him off the ballot, because states under a blanket rule, as Derek mentioned, cannot act absent congressional action to remove federal candidates from the ballot. That's what this decision says. We should remember that as the ballots exist right now in states like Colorado and Maine, and even Illinois, which just last week disqualified former President Trump from the ballot, he's still on those ballots. He's on those ballots, and it just means that those ballots will be counted, those votes will be counted, and delegates will be awarded as appropriate. But in some ways, this also could lead to challenges down the road, because one thing all of the justices apparently agree on is that Congress does have authority in this area under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And that means that should former President Trump win the election in November, this could come up again, particularly on January 6th during the joint session of Congress.
Derek, this kind of reminds me of how we thought about the Supreme Court maybe a few Supreme Courts ago, if you will. Like, you know, I always, considering the widespread impact of a decision is the way I always thought the Supreme Court sort of looked at many of these cases. Right. But then with, you know, Roe v. Wade being overturned and stuff, it seems like that's no longer kind of the tradition of the Supreme Court. So I want you to kind of weigh in on my really rudimentary observation that this reminds me of the court the way that it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, the court is always thinking about the practical concerns and the operation of its decisions, right? When it is the United States Supreme Court, it realizes that it is speaking with precedent that will bind state courts and federal courts throughout the United States. So there's no question that it's trying to speak on an issue with some clarity and to provide some guidance. And I think, you know, when the court is fracturing a little bit in some places here on the implementation, there's no question that a majority of the court here is looking to say, we want to resolve this question, say it is not for states, it is not for any other process except by the mechanism that Congress wants to set up for us. And if it hasn't set up a mechanism, if we don't have that congressional implementation of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, states, you can't do this on your own. So in a degree, it is providing that consistency and guidance for the United States as a whole.
And so, you know, one of the things, David, that I think is for the people in this country, for people who are going to go to the polls, in a way, to the point that Anne Marie is making about the unanimous decision of the Supreme Court justices, both liberal and conservative, I think most Americans, even if you don't like President Trump, you don't like what he represents, you don't like his politics, you don't like his policies, you don't like the man. But I think most Americans would say, look, beat him at the ballot box and don't try to use a state and a state's Supreme Court to try to remove him from the right of Americans to vote for who they like for president. Especially since the Supreme Court did not weigh in as to whether or not the former president engaged in that insurrection in the way that Colorado did.
Yeah, I think the American people and, of course, the courts have an understandable resistance to removing people who might otherwise be eligible to run for office. Now, we have qualifications for office in a variety of contexts. President Obama or President W. Bush couldn't run for re-election. You have to be at least 35 at the time of the oath of office to serve as president. But this was one of those that was more in a gray area. And I think it's understandable that there was some reluctance to remove an otherwise eligible candidate for office, even if he might have been perceived to have engaged in insurrection in violation of the 14th Amendment. But we should note the court did not address that at all, did not look at the factual findings of the lower courts, did not look at whether or not he was an officer of the United States who engaged in insurrection under the 14th Amendment. So it is not an exoneration in that sense. It merely means that Congress did not set up a framework by which the states could remove a federal candidate. And for that reason and that reason alone, no state can remove a federal candidate absent congressional action. So this should put an end, barring some congressional action, which I think is exceedingly unlikely, this should put an end to these ballot challenges for the foreseeable future.
But Derek, David raises an interesting question. So what if we, and I know I'm speculating here, but I'm just trying to understand why the court would not look at the findings of the Colorado Supreme Court, so that if we were to find out that former President Trump was 34 and not 35 years old, that would be something that the Supreme Court would look at, right, and say, well, the findings reveal we've uncovered his birth certificate and he's actually only 34 years old. So that means he can, in that case, they would remove a candidate that perhaps a lot of people want to vote for from the ballot. So why not, beyond the scope of just looking at the third clause of the 14th Amendment, say we've also looked at the findings?
Yeah, so again, the court is really trying to focus on the issue before it, which is only Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I've written about these issues and said states have kept 21-year-olds off the ballot. They've kept Nicaraguan nationals off the ballot. What makes Section 3 different? And there's a few different things going on in the opinion. And I'll start with Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, who wrote separately in the opinion to say, look, we don't think that this provision of the Constitution was designed to empower states. And so it's very strange to think about this provision, which is actually designed to restrict states after the Civil War, after a bunch of states had seceded. There's something unique about this provision. And for the majority, they would look at it and say, this is really about congressional power, congressional judgments, congressional enforcement legislation. And when you're dealing with a presidential candidate who can give this who affects all 50 states, right, to allow one state to make this determination where it's contested at issue, maybe 34-year-old is not contested, but whether someone engaged in an insurrection, without Congress helping us figure out who engaged in an insurrection, whether or not there's a problem, whether or not somebody has been found liable, guilty, whatever it is, it's not up to one state to do it. Congress needs to set the rules here.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Derek Muller and David Becker, as always, we thank you very much for your analysis. Appreciate it.
Sure thing.
Okay, we have a lot more to come after the break. We're going to be joined by Robert Costa and Major Garrett, who's here in studio with us, and Jan Crawford will also join us, so stick around for that.
Well, let me start with this.
This really
Have you told the government?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
You want me to just
What's
keep
wrong
going?
with that argument?
What have you
Do
learned?
you know why?
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 It's time for 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Since you started La Soup in 2014, do you have any sense as to how much food you've rescued from the landfill?
We've rescued 4.5 million pounds.
I can't even fathom how much food that is.
And that's one little person in one little city in America. We're going to call this chicken piccata. We did 450 of these meals today.
This is the exact dish
That
you and
we
I are going to
just-
have.
Yep.
Oh, really good.
Is it good? Mm-hmm. Having a plan of how to keep people fed should be in every single city.
So if we eliminated food waste, could we eliminate
hunger? Yes.
Eating Trash, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
At this moment, terrorists could be plotting another attack.
9/11 triggered a counter-terrorist system that included a secret database.
This person needs a closer look.
A growing list of nearly 2 million people, including some Americans who say they're innocent.
For 1 hour flight, I have to spend 6 hours to go and come back.
CBS Reports explores the system, the people responsible for it, and those pushing for change.
I'm not fighting against them. I'm fighting for them to do the right thing.
The Watch List, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
He was there when the war in Ukraine started.
Extreme history. It's a big moment.
The extraordinary story behind Sean Penn's new Paramount Plus documentary, Superpower, when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
They can help us with medical discovery, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7 that is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable.
The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
Human remains found this week.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
A gripping true crime original, 48 Hours, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
How can we become our best selves? That may be more about character than talent.
The ultimate mark of your potential is how far you've climbed, not how high you've gone.
Realizing your true potential with Adam Grant as we go person to person.
So, of course, we're following the breaking news. The Supreme Court has ruled that former President Donald Trump can appear on the 2024 ballot, overturning Colorado's ruling.
Now, the decision comes after debate over whether the frontrunner for the GOP nomination violated the insurrectionist clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And so we're continuing our coverage of this breaking news. Again, the Supreme Court has ruled that former President Donald Trump can appear on the ballot in Colorado. This decision, of course, comes on the eve of Super Tuesday. Colorado is one of the states where people will be taking to the polls. So CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford is in Washington, and also CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa is joining us. And here in Studio 57, CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett is here. All right, Jan, let me begin with you. We've been sort of going over the decision that the Supreme Court made. You reported earlier this morning on CBS Mornings that you would not be at all be surprised if the decision was unanimous.
Right, and it was. I mean, the decision itself wasn't unanimous. They had slightly different reasons for the justices did, but the bottom line is this court agreed unanimously that the Colorado Supreme Court got it wrong, that states can't look to that clause in the 14th Amendment and say, we're going to be able to disqualify a presidential candidate from our ballots, that one state or a handful of states can't dictate the outcome of a presidential election. That's not what the framers ever intended when they wrote that or when it was passed, of course. So the bottom line is that if you're going to beat Donald Trump, it's going to have to be at the ballot box, not through these state efforts, whether in courts or by officials, to disqualify him from the ballots. I don't think this is a surprise. The Colorado Supreme Court was kind of off on this trip of its own when they released this decision, which was 4-3, narrowly decided. And it was the only court that had reached that decision up until that point. And then, of course, when we saw arguments last month, I think the justices signaled very clearly that they were skeptical of arguments that states should have this authority and kind of the havoc and chaos it could wreak if they did.
And of course, there are other states that have attempted to use the 14th Amendment to do the same thing. So that kind of puts that to bed. But I guess my question is there wiggle room? Are there other arguments bubbling up that we may see working their way through the courts that would also attempt to remove his name from the ballot?
No. But I do think, to your point earlier, Vlad, in the question about whether or not Trump's going to try to make this like, look, the court has cleared me, I'm not an insurrectionist. I mean, he can make that argument if he wants to, but there's nothing in this opinion that suggests that he should be saying that. And furthermore, there's a case that the court's going to hear in April on whether or not he can be tried for his actions around January 6th. So this is not the last word that the Supreme Court's going to have on Donald Trump. And while today he's walking away saying the court is a beautiful thing, like he said after the arguments, he may have a very different tune in April, where I think the court in April, in that case, is probably going to come out the opposite way. I do not think Trump is going to be successful with the sweeping arguments he's making in that case, that he should be immune from prosecution for his actions around January 6th.
So, Bob, to you now, before we bring in Major, what we've been talking about what this might mean for how President Trump, former President Trump campaigns. What does it mean for his base? Does this galvanize them even further?
In just the last few minutes, Vlad, former President Trump has issued a statement on his social media platform calling this day a victory for him, his legal team, his campaign. But to build on what Jan was saying, while this might galvanize his base and make them feel heartened that he is going to be on the ballot across the country, he faces a storm on the horizon, whether it's the hush money case in New York that starts later this month, the ruling on immunity set to come sometime after those April 22nd arguments, late April arguments. And this is a campaign, though, that while former Ambassador Nikki Haley won the Washington, D.C. primary election in recent days, ahead of Super Tuesday, it's Trump who is not only galvanizing his supporters, but he is really getting command of the party, taking over the Republican National Committee. And his campaign, his legal team, feel like they are going to have to spend millions of dollars in the coming months to deal with all of these legal issues. But he's positioned with his fundraising to address all of that.
Major, just to talk about the political implications, you know, Jan said that according to the decision by the court, he can't say he's not an insurrectionist. Right. But I wonder whether he calls himself an insurrectionist or not. Does it even make a difference? Because is it somewhat of a badge of honor anyways
for Trump supporters, it doesn't matter. They've already decided he's not.
Right.
Some have already decided that was an act of patriotism. Whether the rest of the country agrees with that or not will be one of the themes of the 2024 campaign. But let's just step back for a second. Why are we here? Why was there no implementing legislation passed by Congress after the Civil War? Because that massive, bloody trauma was never imagined again in this country. Congress did not feel compelled to specify what insurrection was, because it never imagined we would be faced with that definitional, syntactical problem ever again. We are here because we now have to decide what January 6, 2021 was. To some Americans, it does look like, it's certainly a riot. Was it a riot to stop the peaceful transfer of power? Is that an act of insurrection? This country is debating that. We're here because of that day. Yes, there's no implementing legislation. That's where the court came down. So that's one aspect of it. The court's also making sure that voters are not disenfranchised. Just recall, if President Trump, when he was in office fighting the 2020 election, which he fairly and legally lost, if he had prevailed, he would have disenfranchised millions of voters, his own and Biden supporters, in 7 states. So the court did not go with that, so it's protecting voters on both ends. Third point. The former president right now likes to say, and we talked about this earlier this morning, about being the victim. He cannot call himself a victim of the legal system now. The legal system worked. Voters in Colorado had every right to ask their Supreme Court, was he an insurrectionist? They were, under state law, allowed to ask that question. It went through a trial. The Supreme Court made a decision in Colorado. Now it's been overturned. Nothing was askew legally. Everyone was pursuing the law as presented in their state, and now the Supreme Court said, you know what? We can't do this. So now everyone has clarity on that. But these questions arose because of something that happened. A galvanizing moment, an unforgettable moment in our history that the former president owns, legally, politically, ethically, and morally. And that will be a part of our campaign.
Jan, let me ask you before we wrap up. Do we still have Jan? Yeah.
Yep, I'm here.
Jan, so
I was enjoying Major's analysis.
No,
That was fabulous,
really good.
Major.
We're
I was
so
like, gosh,
lucky.
I hadn't thought about that. That's a really good point.
No, we're so lucky to have all three of you here to break this down for us and for our viewers. But Jan, you mentioned that looming on the calendar is April, when the Supreme Court is expected to weigh in on Trump's sweeping immunity claims.
Yeah, they'll have arguments that week. They haven't set the exact day, but they're going to have arguments. it's going to be quite a show. I would not be surprised if Trump attends those arguments. And, of course, you can imagine the scene outside the court that day.
Absolutely.
That's going to be whether or not the special counsel, Jack Smith, can essentially go forward with the prosecution.
So here's the question, Jan. I've seen some argue that setting the date for those arguments in April was a win for former President Trump and his lawyers because it may perhaps push this trial past the election. Again, which would then not give the voters all the information that they need to make a decision as to who they want to vote for. And I've seen others saying, look, the way you just surmised, that perhaps the court will not rule in former President Trump's favor, which would have huge ramifications no matter what is happening on the trial front. How do you see it?
Well, I mean, first of all, the Supreme Court has expedited this case. I mean, that's what Jack Smith asked for, the special counsel. He asked for a decision this term. He's the one who asked the Supreme Court to take it up, not Trump. And he asked the court to expedite it, and he asked for a decision this term. He's going to get that. So I think it's kind of hard to argue that, you know, what's the court doing? They're just delay, when they're literally doing what the special counsel asked for. There's going to be a decision this term. The question is, why did the Justice Department wait 30 months to charge Trump? And we're in this position anyway. I mean, that's not up to the Supreme Court. So they're doing this in a very fast manner. If they put it on their regular docket, they wouldn't have arguments until, you know, next October, November. That's how they're doing the cases now that come up to the court. So I think that's a hard argument to make. I think these arguments are going to be very complicated. This one I think was more clear today that we got. It was pretty obvious what they were going to do. The arguments were pretty extreme. Trump is making a sweeping argument on immunity that obviously the district court, the appeals court rejected. That's what the Supreme Court is going to review, that he is absolutely immune from prosecution for his official acts as president. I don't think the court will embrace that. But again, they may have different reasons for why, and they may have some kind of qualified, there may be some acts that a president can be prosecuted for. Maybe there aren't others. So this one I think is going to be a little more complicated. But again, I think that the outcome is going to be that Trump is not going to be as happy after that decision comes down as he's going to be today.
And then the courts will be corrupt. And
Right.
it'll be a witch hunt.
Right.
Whatever works for the campaign.
Yeah, exactly. And so, Bob, this question, you've covered Washington for a long time, and Major, you can perhaps weigh in on this as well. The Supreme Court, again, sort of saying that Congress, by a vote of 2/3 of the House, can remove such disability. That's the language that they're using, right, when it comes to how the Constitution is interpreted with regards to the 14th Amendment. Given where we are in our politics in this country, is there anything that could ever be passed in a Congress where you have 2/3 of a majority that agree on something other than benign, like, you know, federal holidays or, you know, like, I mean, anything that has real teeth in it? I don't know. I'm trying to think here.
Well, my motto as a reporter is to assume nothing. And at this point in American history, I don't rule anything out. It was just a few years ago we had an impeachment trial in the United States Senate about an attack on the Capitol and the President of the United States and his alleged complicity in an attack on the certification of an election. We use that word unprecedented a lot in our politics. So at this point, with a deeply divided Congress and a deeply divided nation, it's very unlikely there's going to be some kind of 2/3 majority coalition on removing someone from the ballot or having some overhaul of how we put people on the ballot or elect presidents of the United States. But at the same time, we're living in such a convulsive age that if Congress does start to react a bit different on presidential conduct in the coming years, you could see more Republicans moving away from Trump should he push the norms of the law and politics to the extreme in a way that's seen as necessary for Congress to take that kind of dramatic action. But you're right in the sense of your initial assessment is that there's a very small percentage chance that Congress ever moves in that direction, at least now. But again, assume nothing.
But Major, Congress did have an opportunity. I'm watching, Mitch McConnell give speeches about his retirement. I'm reading articles about this legacy that he has. He is no fan of former President Trump. In fact, some would say that they're completely at loggerheads right now, even though he used Trump as a vessel to get his Supreme Court justices and 200-plus federal judges appointed. He could have stopped them.
He was critical after January 6th.
He was very critical. Could have stopped them with
critical after Trump had not been convicted.
Right. You could have convicted him.
Right.
And he would have not been eligible to run for president.
Precisely. to your question that you posed to Bob a second ago. So you raise a very interesting, both constitutional and political question with that. So the way the 14th Amendment, Section 3 is written, many scholars, and I've read many of the briefs that were given to the court defending what the Colorado Supreme Court said because what that section is about removing this disability by 2/3 vote, that is where Congress decides someone who is an insurrectionist can be elected and can serve. So they remove your insurrectionist past, they cleanse you of it by a 2/3 vote, okay? And many constitutional scholars and historians wrote the Supreme Court and said that proves this is self-executing. You don't need enabling legislation from Congress. Congress wrote in there that it will be obvious that this is an insurrectionist act, and then Congress can look at it and say, well, you were a minor league player in the insurrection. You were not the leader of it. You weren't Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States of America. And we can, through congressional action, remove that disability, remove the thing that is disqualifying you from holding office in the American system. So what the court said is, no, that isn't self-executing. Congress hasn't been clear enough. The amendment doesn't read as it looks like it reads. And then you ask the political way, well, can Congress agree on 2/3 of anything? Not both houses. Maybe one house, maybe the other on one thing, but not together.
Yeah. Wow, it's fascinating. And we got a history lesson.
Love it.
Dan Crawford, Robert Costa, Major Garrett, thank you so much, guys. So ahead, we will continue our breaking news coverage of the Supreme Court's decision to keep former President Trump on the Colorado ballot. We're going to be speaking with the leader of a group challenging the former president and advocating for his removal from the ballot in several states.
Well, can they still be doing that?
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift. I thought she was a groom, and I stepped back and I went, oh, you're the queen. She's gonna be with me every instant that I'm alive.
I just wanted to see if you'd go to Disneyland with me today.
I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm gonna remember that the rest of my life.
They told us when he was gonna be born, he was only gonna live for 30 minutes. It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift. Stream now on the free CBS News app.
There is no more room in our city.
New York City is receiving record numbers of migrants.
Today, we're going to have more than 500 adults and children come through that door.
Tensions rise as shelters reach max capacity.
We don't have to take care of them.
CBS Reports goes inside a crisis cities and families are facing as they fight to survive.
The United States still has a glimmer of hope for people to come here.
Fighting for a future. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's a country music legend, philanthropist, fashion icon, and now rock star.
I think there's a lot to be said about being comfortable with who you are.
Find out what's next for Dolly Parton when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
That desired farm is a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She is a beloved American icon and head of a media empire. But is Oprah Winfrey happy? How do you define happiness?
Yeah, I call it happiness.
Find out when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
It was genocide, a deliberate effort by the United States government to eliminate the food source that was relied upon by Native American tribes.
American bison were slaughtered and Native Americans displaced.
And that's how tribes were subjugated to reservations and our lands were taken.
But now, through conservation efforts at Yellowstone,
Buffalo provided everything that we needed. Now they need help.
a herd grows.
We need to step up and help them.
And a culture is reborn.
When the buffalo return and come back, that's when our tribe will begin to heal.
Yellowstone Bison Revival, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
We are continuing our coverage of breaking news. The Supreme Court has ruled that former President Donald Trump can appear on the 2024 ballot, overturning a decision by Colorado's High Court. So Ron Fine joins us now. He is the legal director for Free Speech for the People. It's an organization challenging former President Trump's right to be on the ballot in a number of states, including Colorado. So I should sort of clarify whether or not you were instrumental, a part of this Anderson case before the Supreme Court, and to get your reaction.
Thank you. We at Free Speech for People pioneered challenges under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment beginning in 2022 against congressional candidates and then against Donald Trump. In this 2024 season, we were joined by another organization called CREW that took the lead on the Colorado case. And just last week, the Illinois courts ruled that Trump engaged in insurrection. And what's important to note is that the Supreme Court's decision today did not exonerate him. They did not say that January 6th wasn't an insurrection, and they did not say that he didn't engage in insurrection. Instead, the court let him off on a technicality.
All right, but what's next for your organization and the fight against the former president's eligibility? Because it seems that the Supreme Court is pretty clear here that attempts by states to remove former President Trump from the ballot should not continue.
That's right. The Supreme Court decided unanimously on that particular point that states cannot do this. They divided bitterly 5-4 on how else Section 3 might be enforced. But it is clear at this point that states cannot be the forum for these challenges going forward. And so, for example, in Illinois, where Trump appealed our decision, or not our decision, our victory in the Illinois courts ruling that he's disqualified, unfortunately, that case is not going to be able to move forward. The most important point, though, is that on the books, it remains as a matter of record that courts in every state that considered the merits ruled that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection and is disqualified. And all the Supreme Court has done today is said that states can't decide that through state court systems. But the Supreme Court refused to say that Trump didn't engage in insurrection.
As you know, he's got a federal trial coming up on his behavior on January 6th. Is that going to be sort of a focus for your group now, even if it doesn't mean sort of bringing cases, obviously not bringing cases, but focusing on sort of the definition of insurrection and whether or not he was a participant and whether or not he's an officer or office of the court, all those arguments?
It's astonishing that Congress and the Justice Department, for at least a full year after the new President Biden came into office, failed to hold Trump accountable. And the reason that he was acquitted in his Senate impeachment trial was that senators, a small minority of senators, felt that he couldn't be tried in impeachment while he was no longer in office, and they said, let the criminal justice system handle it. Well, now the criminal justice system is handling it, and Trump is going to the Supreme Court saying that he should be absolutely immune from any criminal liability whatsoever from his time as president. And the Supreme Court, unfortunately, handed him a gift by granting review in that case, which will push the trial late to the point where it may not even come before the election. And that just shows the extent to which the Supreme Court has been carrying water for Trump, unfortunately.
Ron, here's what Justice Barrett wrote. In my judgment, this is not the time to amplify a disagreement with stridency. The court has settled a politically charged issue in this volatile season of presidential election. Particularly in this circumstance, writings on the court should turn the national temperature down, not up. For our present purposes, our differences are less important than our unanimity. This is the message Americans should take home. On the flip side, to your point, I'm going to read a quote here from Noah Bookbinder, who is part of an organization much like yours. He says every court or decision-making body that has substantially examined the issue has determined January 6th was an insurrection and that Donald Trump did incite it. That remains true today. He's the president of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. So my guess is that you agree less with Justice Barrett and more with Mr. Bookbinder.
Well, this is just exactly what happened after the Civil War. During the initial period of Reconstruction, when this provision of the Constitution was being actively enforced, it did keep insurrectionists out of power at state, local office, and federal office. But then the voices like those of Justice Barrett pushed for what they called at the time reconciliation, and they allowed ex-Confederates to run for office again. And many of the leadership of the Confederacy then returned to power, and that's what gave rise to Jim Crow and an era of white supremacist terror, unfortunately, starting in the late 19th century. So this is a familiar theme that we've heard before, but the lesson of Section 3 and the people who wrote it after the Civil War is that we learned a bloody lesson, which is that those who violated their oath to the Constitution once before will do it again, and even worse if they're allowed back into power. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court has made it much harder to enforce that provision of the Constitution today, but it remains a bedrock principle, and we can expect that if Donald Trump comes anywhere near the presidency, we're going to see a repeat of January 6th or far worse.
Ron, that's such an interesting point, because we were just in our last segment wondering about that very point, whether or not there were former Confederate officers or members of the Confederate states who once again ran for political office after the Civil War ended. And part of the appeal of the United States of America for everybody, people that are here and people that are not here and wish to be here, is that we tend to appeal, as President Lincoln said, we try to appeal to our better angels, and we aspire to be better than what we were. But history proves that when civilization when you leave it in the hands of people, that what you're describing did happen. And to your point, that we got Jim Crow because people thought, well, they learned their lesson.
Right.
And in fact, people had not learned their lesson.
If Donald Trump seemed even the slightest bit repentant about what he did at the end of 2020 and leading up to January 6th, this might be a different circumstance. But he has never stated that he regretted his actions even slightly. He continues to praise the January 6th insurrectionists. He's calling them hostages and political prisoners. And he says that what he did was perfect. Now, if he had shown genuine regret and gone to Congress and asked for 2/3 of both houses of Congress to grant him amnesty and remove the disqualification, this would have been a very different situation. But he hasn't shown the slightest bit of regret. And so there's every reason to think that just like those ex-Confederates who were granted a almost universal amnesty just a couple of years after the Civil War ended, that if he's allowed back into power, he'll do the same.
Wow, Ron Fine, thank you very much for that analysis. We really appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, we're waiting to hear from former President Trump to speak after the Supreme Court unanimously rules he cannot be kicked off the 2024 ballot in Colorado. Looking out for that. And a little later, we're going to take a closer look at the decision with CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. So much to talk about. Stick around.
Original documentary from CBS reports tensions rising between a powerful country and a vital island.
The supply of this technology came grinding to a halt. The world would grind to a halt. Absolutely.
As Taiwan faces threats and aggression,
Taiwan is on the front line, and we understand our responsibility as a democracy. We cannot fall.
CBS News examines whether they can defend themselves.
Putin, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, there are manifestations of the battle between autocracy and democracy. And that is a fight that we're all engaged in.
Defending Taiwan, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
We love music as much as you do. CBS Mornings.
Your morning routine just got better.
I love that.
CBS Mornings.
Okay, so let's just start at the beginning.
Well, let me start with this.
What is at stake here?
What is the answer then?
Do you know why?
You want me to just keep going?
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Were there death threats?
How is this possible?
What's wrong with that argument?
Are you saying they lied?
Have you told the government that? Why won't you say the word crisis?
You're not answering my question.
This really is that scary?
Does that make sense?
What do you mean? What does that mean? Did any of that make sense? What's your response?
What happened?
Why?
It's time for the CBS News Original 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Dragon capsule here in space.
Sightseers in space, the thrill of a lifetime.
Seeing the Earth from space, it was so exhilarating.
But the risks that come with the territory.
There have been 4 fatal accidents. That's a 1% fatal accident rate.
Might make you look before you launch.
If you had 1 out of 100 airplanes falling out of the sky, we'd have a public crisis.
Space tourism, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Morning news matters because it sets the tone for your day, and it's a way of getting you started.
We take you places, teach you new things, and we make you feel like, it's not all bad. We're going to uplift you.
People say to me, you always seem to be having a good time. I mean, you know what? You're right.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings.
When weather turns extreme.
A massive storm with winds of 150 miles per hour.
The storm strengthened again overnight.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real, you'll have time to get prepared. Feel the forecast. Weather when it matters most on CBS News.
I wake up every morning asking, what's happening in the world? Why is this happening? And how do we answer that question? After the tragic loss of beloved newsman Tim Russert, his son went on a worldwide journey to find himself.
I struggled with his grief for a long time.
How Luke Russert is honoring the legacy of his father when we go person to person.
We are continuing our coverage of the breaking news. The Supreme Court has ruled that former President Donald Trump can appear on the 2024 ballot, overturning a decision by Colorado's High Court. And of course, there will be a ripple effect because a number of other states have also presented similar arguments.
Jessica Levinson is joining us now. She's a CBS News legal contributor and a professor at Loyola Law School in California. Jessica, let me ask the question that I think we've talked a lot about why the justices ruled the way that they did. But here's an interesting question that someone raised in the last segment. Why did the Justice Department, Merrick Garland, wait 30 months for this to begin?
So that's a question, I hate to say it, but in part for the Justice Department. But when we look at the other case that we've been talking about, Vlad, that question of whether or not there is immunity from criminal prosecution, that question weighs really heavily because I know the criticism of the Supreme Court in deciding not to hold oral arguments until April 22nd is, well, they've basically decided now that we won't have a trial until either right before the election or it just can't happen before the election. And I think your question is part of that broader story, which is the Justice Department could have moved more quickly. Now, let's be clear that the Justice Department didn't have an easy go of it in the sense that I would offer that the former president has a tactic when it comes to any type of litigation of delay, delay, delay. So it was difficult to get all of the evidence. It was difficult to marshal the right sorts of documents, testimony, everything else. This is a complicated case, but I think that's certainly part of the story here in terms of accountability, which is, could the Department of Justice have acted more quickly? And I think their answer would be, we don't act based on the electoral calendar. We act based on when we have the evidence that we know we can. Yes.
Great point. We're going to have to, unfortunately, cut into you, come to the end of the show.
Exactly.
But Jessica Levinson, thank you so much.
Always great to have you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to be breaking down this major decision. Stick around. We'll be right back.
We are about to see American weapons in the hands of Mexican cartels.
A gun pipeline to Mexico.
We are arming the cartels.
100%, no doubt about it.
Happening right under our noses.
Who's doing something about this? Nobody.
A CBS Reports exclusive.
Most Americans have no idea that we are effectively arming the enemy next door.
This is the story the American people need to know.
Arming cartels. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
people from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
Feel the forecast on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell.
We aim every night to be factual and fair. That's our goal.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Imagine yourself in Manhattan with no police, no army, no mayor.
The people of Haiti stare down poverty, corruption, natural disasters, and violence.
90% of the guns that are used by gangs in Haiti are American guns.
But with an unbreakable spirit and eternal optimism.
There are days where I cry, but we can't be discouraged. We still believe in Haiti.
They're still able to look ahead with hope.
Haiti is on the brink of transformation, a radical shift. Nations are coming together and saying things must change.
Fighting for Haiti, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Since childhood, she never stopped reaching for the skies. Now she's spent more time in space than any other American.
I like being a part of something bigger than me.
Peggy Whitson's extraordinary career as a history-making astronaut when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And it becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag #OscarSoWhite was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, oh, we're going to tell you about that too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Our story's just begun.
Why did you want to share your story?
Water up this high?
Where are these coming from?
That's the million-dollar question.
I'm a very curious person. I wake up every morning asking, what's happening in the world? Why is this happening? And how do we